The wind howled like a wounded animal, driving sub-zero needles of ice into his skin. Hypothermia was minutes away. Then a jagged silhouette emerged from the whiteout, an abandoned cabin. He broke the glass to survive the night, never suspecting the stone fireplace held a 50-year-old million-dollar secret. Thomas Halloway was a man accustomed to isolation, but the kind of isolation that comes with a warm cup of coffee and a locked apartment door, not the brutal, unforgiving solitude of the Bitterroot Mountains in late November. He was 34, a freelance location scout for independent films, tasked with finding rugged, untouched landscapes for an upcoming survival thriller. He had found his rugged landscape all right, and it was going to kill him. It started with a simple miscalculation. The weather report on his AM radio had predicted a mild dusting of snow, a typical late autumn flurry for western Montana. But weather in the high country doesn't care about meteorologists. By 3 p.m., the sky had bruised into a deep, sickly purple. By 3:30 p.m., the snow was falling so thick and fast, it created a disorienting, vertigo-inducing wall of white. Thomas had been driving his 1998 Jeep Cherokee down an unpaved logging road, trying to loop back to the main highway before dusk. Then the radiator hose blew. It was a loud, wet pop, followed by a hissing cloud of steam that instantly froze against his windshield. He sat in the rapidly cooling cab of his vehicle for an hour, hoping a logging truck or a park ranger would pass by. Nobody did. As the temperature plummeted toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit, Thomas realized the terrifying reality of his situation. He had no cell service, half a bottle of water, a lighter, and a thin canvas jacket meant for a brisk autumn walk, not a blizzard. Staying in the metal tomb of his Jeep meant freezing to death by midnight. His only option was to walk back the way he came and pray he found shelter. He stepped out into the storm, and the wind immediately punched the breath from his lungs. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical entity, biting into his cheeks and turning his fingers numb within minutes. Thomas trudged through snow that was already knee-deep. Every step was an exhausting battle against the drifts. 1 mile, 2 miles. The world was reduced to a swirling, chaotic vortex of white. He lost the logging road completely. His mind began to play cruel tricks on him. He saw warm lights flickering in the distance, only to realize they were just the moonlight catching the snow. His legs felt like lead pillars. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and a dangerous, warm drowsiness began to creep into his mind. "Just lay down for a minute," his brain whispered. "Just close your eyes." Hypothermia was setting in. He stumbled over a buried root and collapsed face first into a snowbank. He didn't want to get up. It was so peaceful down there. But as he turned his head to take one last, fading look at the world, a break in the wind revealed a sharp, unnatural angle in the tree line, just 50 yards away. It wasn't a rock formation, it was a roof line. Adrenaline, sharp and desperate, flooded his system. Thomas forced himself onto his hands and knees, crawling through the powder like a wounded animal. As he drew closer, the silhouette materialized into a small, dilapidated log cabin, heavily camouflaged by decades of overgrowth and snow. It sagged heavily to one side, the timber black with rot and age. There were no tracks leading to it, no smoke curling from the chimney. He reached the front porch, the rotten wood groaning under his weight, and threw his shoulder against the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. The lock was rusted solid into the hasp. Desperation stripping away all caution, Thomas stumbled toward a small, grimy window to the right of the door. He wrapped his frozen hand in the sleeve of his canvas jacket grabbed a heavy piece of loose firewood from the porch and smashed it into the pane. The glass shattered with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed deafening in the isolated wilderness. He reached carefully through the jagged teeth of the broken window, unlatched it, and hoisted himself inside, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards in a heap of shivering, gasping exhaustion. It was freezing inside, but the howling wind was immediately cut off. The silence of the cabin was heavy and oppressive, smelling of dry rot, ancient pine resin, and something else. A stale, metallic tang of undisturbed history. Thomas lay on the floor for 10 minutes, just breathing, feeling the agonizing pins and needles of blood trying to return to his extremities. When he finally gathered the strength to stand, he flicked his silver Zippo lighter. The small dancing orange flame pushed back the darkness, revealing a room that looked as though it had been holding its breath for half a century. The cabin was a time capsule. A thick layer of grey dust coated everything. In the corner sat a rusty iron bed frame with a decaying, moth-eaten mattress. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 chairs. On the table rested an old ceramic coffee percolator and a tin mug, left exactly as they were the day the owner walked out. Against the far wall was a heavy wooden wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar, revealing empty hangers. But Thomas's eyes didn't care about the history. They locked onto the only thing that mattered for his survival. Spanning the entire right wall of the cabin was a massive, beautifully constructed riverstone fireplace. If he didn't get a fire going in the next 20 minutes, the shelter of the cabin wouldn't be enough to save him. The ambient temperature inside was still well below freezing, and his wet clothes were siphoning away his core body heat. He limped over to the wooden chairs. Raising his heavy boot, he stomped down on the brittle wood, shattering the legs and backrest into splintered kindling. He gathered old, brittle newspapers that had been stuffed into the cracks of the walls for insulation. Their dates, he briefly noted through his blurred vision, were from 1968. He carried his makeshift fuel to the hearth. The fireplace was deep and cavernous, lined with soot and ash that had turned to a solid black crust over the decades. Thomas knelt on the cold stone hearth, his hands shaking violently as he arranged the paper and the shattered chair wood. He sparked the lighter. Once. Twice. The flint caught, and he touched the flame to the yellowed 1968 newspaper. It flared up immediately, casting wild, flickering shadows across the logs of the cabin. But as the flames grew, the cabin quickly began to fill with stinging, acrid smoke. It billowed out into the room, blinding him and sending him into a fit of violent coughing. The flu, he realized, panicking. The chimney damper is closed. If he couldn't open it, he would have to put the fire out or suffocate. He grabbed a thick branch from the chair and reached up into the dark, soot-stained throat of the chimney, blindly feeling for the iron lever that would open the damper. His stick scraped against the cold iron of the flue. He pushed, trying to pry it open, but it was rusted shut. Swearing through chattering teeth, Thomas dropped the stick and wrapped his jacket sleeve around his hand. He thrust his arm directly up into the cold, filthy chimney, ignoring the soot raining down on his face, searching for the lever with his bare fingers. He felt the rough iron plate of the damper. He slid his hand along the edge, looking for the catch. Instead, his fingers brushed against something else. Something that didn't belong in a chimney. About 2 feet up, hidden on a narrow stone ledge just behind the iron damper, his fingers snagged on a thick canvas strap. It wasn't part of the fireplace. It was something deliberately wedged into the masonry. Thomas pulled on it. It didn't move. He grabbed it with both hands, bracing his boots against the hearth and yanked with all the desperate strength he had left. With a sickening scrape of metal against stone, a heavy, brick-sized object dislodged from the hidden shelf. It tumbled down the chimney shaft, slamming into the iron grate, nearly crushing his hand, and landed with a heavy, dead thud directly in the center of his struggling fire. Thomas scrambled backward, coughing on the smoke, staring at the object now smothering his flames. He grabbed his broken stick and quickly rolled the heavy object out of the fire and onto the stone hearth before it could burn. As the smoke began to slowly filter out through the broken window, Thomas knelt beside his discovery, his shivering momentarily forgotten. It was a heavy steel lockbox about the size of a large dictionary. It was wrapped tightly in a heavy, fire-resistant cloth, asbestos, most likely, given the era, which was charred and blackened on the outside, but had perfectly preserved the box within. The leather strap he had pulled was riveted to the cloth wrapping, designed as a handle to retrieve it from the hidden chimney shelf. Thomas stared at it. The primal need for warmth warred with intense, sudden curiosity. Who hides a lockbox inside a chimney in the middle of the Montana wilderness? He looked back at the fire. The flames, freed from the heavy box, were finally catching the wood, and a small, merciful wave of heat began to radiate outward. He could breathe. He was going to live. He turned his attention back to the box. The steel was pitted with rust, and a heavy brass padlock secured the latch. Thomas wasn't about to leave it closed. He went to the kitchen area, rummaged through a rusted toolbox sitting under the counter, and found a heavy iron crowbar. Sitting cross-legged in front of the warming fire, he wedged the curved end of the crowbar under the brass padlock. He threw his weight into it. The old brass groaned, fought for a moment, and then snapped with a sharp ping. Thomas pulled the lock away, his heart pounding in his chest. He threw back the latch and slowly opened the lid. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, a wave of distinct, musty air wafted up, the smell of old paper, leather, and enclosed spaces. The box was packed to the brim. Lying on top was a stack of United States currency. But it wasn't modern money. They were large, crisp bills, bundled tightly with dry, rotted rubber bands that snapped as soon as Thomas touched them. He picked up one of the bills, holding it near the firelight. It was a $100 bill, but the seal was bright red, not green. A red seal United States note, Thomas thought, his mind racing. He knew a bit about antiques from his film prop days. These hadn't been printed since the 1960s. He quickly counted the first bundle. $10,000. He lifted it, revealing 5 more bundles underneath. $60,000 in pristine, untraceable vintage currency. In today's money, the collector value alone would be staggering. But it wasn't the money that made Thomas's blood run cold. It was what lay beneath the cash. Underneath the bundles of hundreds was a heavy, dull yellow ingot, a gold bar roughly the size of a modern smartphone, stamped with a serial number and a crude assayer's mark. Next to it were 3 more, easily 20 pounds of solid gold. "What the hell is this?" Thomas whispered aloud to the empty room, the sound of his own voice startling him. "Bank robbers? A D.B. Cooper situation?" Cooper. He pushed the gold aside. At the very bottom of the box, resting on a bed of velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal and a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. Thomas wiped his dirty, soot-stained hands on his jeans. He carefully lifted the envelope. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. Written across the front, in elegant, looping cursive ink, were 3 words: "For Beatrice Wright." Thomas carefully broke the wax seal and slid out a stack of letters. The paper felt fragile, almost like dead leaves. He unfolded the top letter and leaned closer to the fire to read the faded blue ink. December 4th, 1968. My dearest Beatrice, if you are reading this, it means I never made it to Spokane, and it means he finally found me. I told you once that the money from the First National Trust was gone, lost in the bureaucratic nightmare of my father's passing. I lied. I had to lie to keep you safe from him. I didn't lose the inheritance. I stole it back. The man who orchestrated the theft of our family's estate wasn't some faceless banker bee. It was Deputy Sheriff Samuel Dempsey. He used his badge to forge the foreclosure on the Valley Ranch, and he thought he left me with nothing. He thought I was just a stupid kid. Thomas stopped reading, his eyes wide. He knew the name Dempsey. Anyone who had spent time in this part of Montana knew the name. The Dempsey family owned half the commercial real estate in the county. Samuel Dempsey hadn't just been a deputy sheriff in the 60s. He had gone on to become a state senator, a local legend, a pillar of the community. Thomas swallowed hard and kept reading. I broke into Dempsey's private safe at the precinct last night. I took back what he stole from us, and then some. The gold, the cash. It's all here. But he saw me, Bea. He saw my face as I was leaving the station. I've been running for 2 days, pushing deep into the Bitterroots. The snow is falling heavily now, covering my tracks. But I know he's out there. He has dogs. He has men who will do whatever he asks. I found an old trapper's cabin near the ridge. I am hiding the box in the chimney structure. If I survive the night, I will come for you, and we will disappear to Canada just like we promised. If I don't, Dempsey must never find this. The journal in this box contains every date, every bribe, and every illicit property transfer Dempsey executed over the last decade. It's enough to send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. Do not trust the local police. Do not trust anyone with a badge in this county. Take this to the FBI in Seattle. I love you, Bea. I am so cold, but thinking of you keeps me warm. Forever yours, Arthur Pendleton. Thomas slowly lowered the letter. The roar of the blizzard outside seemed to fade, replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence inside his own head. This wasn't just a lost treasure. This was a murder motive. Arthur Pendleton had clearly never made it to Spokane. He had hidden this box in 1968, and 50 years later, it was still here, which meant Arthur had likely died in this very forest, maybe to the elements. Or maybe Deputy Sheriff Samuel Dempsey had caught up with him, killed him in on the snow, and never managed to find the box hidden up the dark, soot-filled chimney. Thomas looked down at the leather journal at the bottom of the box. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten ledgers, names, dates, amounts. A blueprint of political corruption and theft that had built one of the most powerful political dynasties in the state of Montana. Senator Samuel Dempsey had passed away a few years ago, Thomas recalled from a news article he'd seen while researching the area. But his son, William Dempsey, was currently running for governor. The Dempsey family empire was still very much alive, funded entirely by the blood and theft documented in Thomas's freezing hands. Suddenly, the wind outside shifted. Thomas froze. Over the howling gale, he heard a sound that made his stomach drop. It was faint, muffled by the snow and the thick log walls, but it was unmistakable. The heavy, mechanical crunch, crunch, crunch of snowmobile tracks, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the cabin. Thomas snapped the lockbox shut. He wasn't just a stranded hiker anymore. He was sitting on a 50-year-old crime scene, holding the match that could burn down the most powerful family in the state. And out in the storm, someone was coming. The mechanical growl of the engine cut entirely, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He had seconds. He shoved the gold, the cash, the journal, and the letters back into the steel lockbox and slammed the lid shut. Looking wildly around the dimly lit cabin, his eyes landed on the rusted iron bed frame in the corner. He dragged the heavy box across the dusty floorboards, shoved it deep underneath the moth-eaten mattress, and kicked a pile of ancient, rotting canvas tarps over it. He had barely stood up and brushed the soot from his jeans when heavy boots crunched onto the front porch. The door handle rattled aggressively. Finding it still frozen and rusted shut, the newcomer didn't hesitate. A heavy boot slammed against the wood, just below the handle. The ancient hinges splintered, and the door burst open, sending a swirl of violent white snow into the cabin. A massive figure stepped through the frame, ducking under the low clearance. He was completely obscured by a heavy, fur-lined parka, a black neoprene face mask, and snow goggles. He carried a high-powered hunting rifle slung casually over his right shoulder. Thomas backed away slowly, instinctively gripping the heavy iron crowbar he had used to break the padlock. The man pulled down his face mask and pushed up his goggles, revealing a square, weathered face and cold, assessing eyes. He didn't look like search and rescue. He looked entirely too calm for a man who had just kicked down a door in a blizzard. "Hell of a night for a hike, friend," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He stepped further inside, kicking the broken door shut behind him to block the wind. He unslung the rifle, holding it loosely in both hands. "Saw the smoke from the ridge. You're lucky I was out running the perimeter." "My Jeep broke down a few miles back," Thomas said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I was just trying to survive the night. I didn't mean to trespass." "Oh, you're trespassing, all right," the man said, taking a slow look around the cabin. "This whole valley is private property, Dempsey Timber and Mining. I'm Clayton Miller, head of security for the family." Thomas's blood ran cold. Dempsey. "I'll pay for the broken window and the door," Thomas offered, taking another subtle step back toward the bed. "If you could just give me a ride to the nearest highway." Miller wasn't listening. His eyes were tracing the room, taking in the splintered chairs, the blazing fire, and finally, resting on the stone hearth. Thomas realized his fatal mistake. Sitting plainly on the grey stone, illuminated by the dancing firelight, was the heavy, snapped brass padlock, completely free of dust. Right next to it was the charred asbestos cloth that had wrapped the hidden box for 50 years. Miller's gaze locked onto the padlock. The casual, friendly demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, dangerous tension. The Dempsey family knew about the missing money. They knew Arthur Pendleton had stolen the ledgers, and they had likely been looking for this exact cabin for decades. "You found something," Miller said softly, his thumb shifting to click the safety off his rifle. The metallic snick echoed loudly in the small room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas lied, his grip tightening on the crowbar behind his back. "Don't play stupid," Miller growled, raising the barrel of the rifle toward Thomas's chest. "Senator Dempsey spent a fortune sending crews into these woods trying to find Pendleton's stash before he died. Mr. William Dempsey wants it found before the gubernatorial election. Now I'm going to ask you once. Where is the box?" Thomas stared down the black barrel of the rifle. He knew with terrifying clarity that handing over the lockbox meant his immediate execution. He would become just another tragedy of the Bitterroot Mountains. It's up in the chimney," Thomas stammered. He raised his left hand in a slow, trembling surrender, keeping his right hand firmly wrapped around the iron crowbar concealed behind his leg. On a ledge. I couldn't pull it down. Miller frowned. His eyes darted toward the roaring hearth for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Thomas would get. He lunged, swinging the heavy iron crowbar upward with desperate adrenaline-fueled strength. Thomas smashed the curved end into the underside of the rifle barrel. The weapon jerked violently upward, just as Miller's finger contracted. The deafening crack of a gunshot shattered the cabin's ceiling, raining splintered wood and snow down upon them. Before the enforcer could recover, Thomas kicked out, burying his heavy winter boot into Miller's knee. The massive man roared in pain, stumbling backward and crashing through the decaying wooden table. Thomas dove towards the bed, ripped the heavy canvas tarps aside, and grabbed the lockbox's thick leather strap. Hugging the cold steel against his chest, he scrambled toward the shattered doorway. "You're dead!" Miller bellowed, untangling himself from the splintered wood and racking the bolt of his rifle. Thomas threw himself into the blinding chaos of the blizzard. The snowmobile idled just 10 feet away, its headlight cutting a singular beam through the whiteout. A bullet blasted through the porch post, inches from Thomas's ear. He vaulted over the seat, shoved the lockbox between his legs, and slammed the throttle wide open. The heavy treads bit into the deep powder, launching the machine forward. He blindly navigated the treacherous mountain slope, dodging the black silhouettes of pine trees as the wind swallowed Miller's furious shouts. He rode for what felt like hours, his hands frozen into immovable claws, descending the mountain until the trees abruptly parted. The blinding headlights of a long-haul semi-truck blasted through the storm. Thomas had found Interstate 90. 2 days later, Thomas sat in a secure conference room at the Seattle FBI field office, following Arthur Pendleton's 50-year-old warning. Do not trust local badges. Across the table, a senior federal prosecutor carefully turned the brittle pages of the ledger. "This is a road map of extortion and illegal land seizures," the agent breathed, eyes wide. "William Dempsey's gubernatorial campaign is funded by shell companies listed right here. We're dispatching federal marshals to the Dempsey estate immediately." 3 weeks later, William Dempsey's arrest dominated national headlines, but Thomas was a state away, standing in a quiet assisted living facility in Spokane, Washington. He knocked on room 204 and found Beatrice Wright sitting by a sunlit window. Her sharp blue eyes looked up curiously. "Beatrice?" Thomas asked gently, kneeling beside her. He placed the faded manila envelope into her frail hands. Beatrice gasped. Her trembling fingers traced the familiar cursive ink she hadn't seen in half a century. Tears spilled down her wrinkled cheeks. "Where did you find this?" "He left it for you," Thomas whispered softly. "He wanted you to know he never stopped fighting for you, and he loved you until the end." In the hallway, a heavy duffel bag rested against the wall, holding $60,000 in vintage Red Seal notes and 20 pounds of gold. The Dempsey empire had fallen, and a 50-year-old promise was finally fulfilled. What would you do if you were trapped in a blizzard with a 50-year-old million-dollar secret? Drop a comment below with your survival strategy. If this cold case mystery gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this story with your true crime-obsessed friends. And don't forget to subscribe with notifications turned on, so you never miss the thrilling conclusion of our hidden treasure dramas. Stay warm, stay safe, and keep exploring.